Hello, everybody. Good afternoon and welcome to this event, Gender Essential Workers and the Crisis. My name's Rose Cook. I'm a Senior Research Fellow at the Global Institute for Women's Leadership at King's College London. And this event forms part of a workshop series we've been organising as part of our project, Gendering COVID-19 Social Policy Responses, which is a project that's funded by the Economic and Social Research Council here in the UK. So that was just to briefly introduce the context to this event that you're attending today. I'll now hand over to our chair, Michael Sonato, to properly kick off the event. Thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy today's event.
Oh, thank you, Rose. So I'm Michael Sonato. I'm a contributor to The Guardian with a focus on labor and economic issues. We're here to talk about essential workers. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, governments around the world published lists of key or essential workers whose jobs were critical to the COVID-19 response. People in these jobs continued to go into workplaces while countries were locked down. These jobs included healthcare jobs, such as doctors and nurses, but also jobs such as care workers, supermarket and food service employees, refuse collectors. A wide cross-section of non-healthcare workers were suddenly considered crucial to the functioning of society, and these included some of the worst paid and most insecure jobs in the economy. And these workers deemed essential were often praised as heroes by employers and government leaders, but these workers faced greater risks while reporting increased burnout in these industries, aggressive and abusive customers and employers, high rates of mental, emotional, and physical stress, as these workers saw some of the underlying problems in their jobs before the pandemic, such as low pay, understaffing, high workloads, and a lack of resources and safety protections worsened during the pandemic. A frequent characterization from essential workers has been that they went from heroes to zeros through the pandemic, as any facade of praise or admiration from employers or the public dissipated during the pandemic in a push to return to normal. And partly as a result, there has been a significant amount of worker activity throughout the pandemic in the form of strikes, walkouts, protests, organizing efforts, and workers quitting their jobs in essential industries such as food service. While low pay, job insecurity, and a lack of recognition affect many essential workers, the situation is particularly stark for women essential workers. Some of the worst paid jobs are in the care sector, which is predominantly staffed by women. In the UK, of workers in roles with high exposure to the virus, 77% are women, and these demographics are similar in the US and other countries in Europe. In some of these jobs, health risks are often considered part of the job, yet for others, this was the first time they had been exposed to significant risk at work. Moreover, of those in high-risk roles and being paid low-pay wages, a staggering 98% are women. As the spotlight has been shown on the importance of essential workers and the enormity of their personal sacrifices, praise and admiration was given way to recognition of the long-term undervaluation of these roles and what needs to be done to secure better pay and conditions for the broad spectrum of these workers. In this workshop, we're going to explore the various impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic on different types of essential workers, particularly female-dominated roles, compare policy responses around the world, as well as hearing about an upsurge of activism and organizing to enhance and improve the rights and conditions of these workers. Our guests today include Michael Legofinger, who is an independent research and PhD student. He was previously at Johannes Kepler University in Linz, Austria, and a member of the Trinational Research Project on Trinational live-in care arrangements. His research interests include care and gendered social policy, with most recently a focus on the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on live-in care and its workers. And this year he published in Sage's Global Social Policy and on LSE's European Politics and Policy blog on live-in care during the pandemic, and acted as a guest editor of a theme section in the SSCI ranked journal Sociologia. Nicole G Berner is General Counsel of the Service Employees International Union, an organization of 2 million members united by the belief in dignity and worth of workers and the services they provide, and dedicated to improving the lives of workers and their families and creating a more just and humane society. Nicole provides strategic legal advice to the union on a broad range of matters, including SEIU's innovative organizing campaigns. She's also a partner at James & Hoffman, a Washington, D.C. based union-side labor law firm. And our third guest, Nikki Hound, is the TUC's Women's Policy Officer and has worked with the TUC for 2.5 years. Her background is focused in economics and retail logistics, but her interest in equality has seen her develop into an equalities champion for trade union members. Nikki leads the TUC's policy and campaign work on women's rights, representation, and equality in the workplace. She works on policy issues such as women's health and safety in the workplace, sexual harassment and gender-based violence, representation of women in unions, occupational segregation, women in the labor market, equal pay, sex discrimination, and maternity rights. So now we're going to transition to our speaker presentations. So I believe Michael is going first. Michael, if you want to start off by adding anything to your introduction.
Thank you very much for the invitation and the kind introduction. I used to be at Johannes Kepler University, which Michael already mentioned, and I was in a project called Decent Care Work on transnational home care arrangements, and we focused on Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. My presentation today will focus predominantly on Austria, but is also influenced on some of those other 2 countries, or in general from other countries as well. Michael already said that the pandemic highlighted some employees or some groups of employees as critical or key workers or essential workers. So as he already mentioned, they're typically not highly regarded in the public eye. They're precarious and often not well paid. And many of them are dominated by migrants, women, or migrant women. So he already mentioned supermarket staff, but he also had agricultural laborers. For example, last spring, Germany flew in many Central and Eastern Europeans to help with the asparagus harvest. You have parcel delivery people, you have transportation workers, and as he already mentioned, you also have healthcare and social care workers. But in many countries, there was actually a little bit of a distinction between the 2. Predominantly in the public eye were healthcare workers working in hospitals, and social care workers in some of the countries were not as highly regarded. In this group of health and social care workers, you also have migrant care workers, and I'm going to talk about living care workers today. We have several European countries that have living care workers. Those are care workers who not only work in the households of the recipients of their care, but also live there during their work periods. They typically come from Central and Eastern European countries, and they work in Western European countries. One of them is Austria. Austria also has not only this model as others in an illegal or not as legal fashion, we actually have a legalized and publicly subsidized model of living care. What's different to some of the other groups of employees or some of the other jobs is that these workers typically face additional inequalities and vulnerabilities. When we're talking about living care workers in Austria, we're talking about 95% of women, and most of them are over 40 years old, and almost 1 in 5 are actually 60 years or older. They face job market discrimination in their countries of origin. They come often from areas in their countries with very low, not a very big job market, and also, again, as women of not old age, but at least when you consider working age of higher working age, they face discrimination there. However, what's untypical or unusual compared to some of the other key workers is that they are what's called circular migrants. They're not residents of Austria or other countries where they work, because they're typically circulating from their countries of origin, where they're based most of the time, to the country they're working. So their localities are imagined as being somewhere else. When, for example, we're discussing their income, their very low income, it's often not compared to other social care workers in Austria. It's typically compared to others in their own country. So it's not said, yeah, it's a low income for a worker in Austria. It's compared for, yeah, it's a high income for somebody from Romania, somebody from Slovakia. During the pandemic, especially at the beginning, closed borders threatened this legalized and also publicly subsidized living care model in Austria. So the government pretty much, before even the first lockdown came into effect, announced several measures, announced that we will take care of this sector and will ensure that this sector will continue to work. For example, they announced that they will provide up to 100 million euros to the long-term care sector in general and living care specifically. They also announced that they will negotiate care corridors so care workers, migrant care workers, can actually cross the border and continue to work in Austria. One of the things that they quickly did was they organized flights in April and then special night trains in May to bring in those care workers that were needed in Austria. However, the government pretty much focused its response on safeguarding the living care model for its users. So whenever they took on a measure, whenever they announced a policy response, pretty much always addressed the care recipients, or at least it was publicly discussed as such. We have a allowance for living care recipients, and typically you have to have 2 care workers alternating in the same month for you to receive the full allowance. However, that was almost immediately waived. So the financial interests of the household were taken care of almost instantly. They also, as I already mentioned, organized the border crossings to help living care workers come to Austria, but it was always discussed in a way that this is to ensure a supply of care workers for the household. You could have discussed this as a measure to bring in care workers so they are able to work, but it wasn't. It was framed as this is to help the Austrian households maintain this living care model, to have care workers at their disposal. The problems care workers faced, however, like testing requirements or unpaid quarantine or even loss of income, something like that, they were almost exclusively ignored, or if they were on the radar of the government, they were regarded as like secondary concerns that they didn't really take care of. Again, this has to do with them, the care workers, being localized in another country. So the problems they face, maybe those should be dealt with in the countries of origin. So if they don't have an income any longer, why not get unemployment in the country where you're from? So now, is the pandemic as this window of opportunity for a change? You could have think like, yeah, we can combat the precarity. We are going to go for better working conditions, higher wages. And if you'd asked me last spring, maybe April, May 2020, I would have said, yeah, definitely, we're going to see a change because this cannot be how we're going to go forward. The care sector in general and living care in specifically will see better working conditions, higher wages. 20 months in, I will tell you, I don't think we'll see that. What we saw is more self-organizing by care workers, by migrant care workers, both on and offline. And in the beginning, especially, it was also like discussion in those groups. We need to have higher wages. We need to better our working conditions. However, over time, one can see that as unemployment increased also in the countries of origin, there was this added pressure to still take on jobs, even if they're not well paid or if the working conditions are not the best. And the second, and I'm going to repeat this, the second biggest problem from an Austrian perspective is that they're not considered residents. Again, they're localized in this other country somewhere else. It's not a problem for Austria. So the problems they face have to be solved also somewhere else. I'm looking forward to discussion, and I'm going to give over to Michael again.
Well, thank you, Michael. Next, we have Nicole Berner, the General Counsel with the SCIU, and she has some slides to walk us through as well. So thank you, Nicole, for joining us. Nicole, I think your mic's still off.
Good day, everyone. Good morning from the United States. It's such a great honor to be with this group, and I appreciate having an opportunity to talk about women care workers in the time of the pandemic. I want to just, I'm assuming folks are not familiar with the Service Employees International Union, and I wanted to just share with you a little bit about our organization and who we are. The Service Employees International Union, or SEIU, is an organization of 2 million service workers in the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico. We represent workers in property services, healthcare, and public services, and about 70% of our members are women, and a majority of our members are people of color. We represent workers that have now been deemed essential in hospitals, so including nurses, doctors, and technicians, but we also represent workers in airports, in office buildings, security officers, janitors, bus drivers for public schools, school lunch staff, nurses, and we organize the caregiving workforce in the United States, which includes both home care and child care. And then we, through the Fight for 15 and a union, we represent fast food workers. For all the workers that we represent, the pandemic brought difficulties, as you can imagine, and have already been talked about. Through 2020 and into 2021, our members throughout the United States have been falling ill from being infected at work. We've had hundreds of members die from COVID-19. But I want to focus on the impacts of the pandemic on women workers in caregiving, including the largely non-unionized areas in this country, which include home care, child care, and fast food. So just before the pandemic, I just want to make clear that even before getting into the impact of the pandemic, low-wage workers in the United States were already in crisis. Workers had no access to many of the benefits that are taken for granted in other parts of the world and in the countries that you're talking about. For example, before the pandemic, the workers, non-union workers, had no access to paid family leave, no right to paid sick leave, and many don't have health insurance. We have no uniform federal unemployment insurance program either. And so whether or not individuals would receive unemployment insurance and how much they would receive and on what conditions is determined here on a state-by-state basis and varies largely greatly between the states. As I mentioned, health insurance is very unstable, continues to be unstable, and in many states, workers have difficulty accessing any benefits before the pandemic. And finally, I just want to note that a significant portion of our low-wage workforce in this country is undocumented, which means they lack work authorization to work in the United States, and that makes these workers uniquely vulnerable to abuse. They are excluded from the social safety net programs that do exist, and often are afraid to come forward when they are victims of retaliation or discrimination in the workforce. So we lack, even before the pandemic, a social safety net. The wages for workers have been consistently decreasing steadily in the United States for decades. Before COVID-19, 1 in 9 American workers was paid poverty level wages. So even though working full time, many more than one job, workers live in poverty. And the real value of the minimum wage in the United States has actually declined to 31% between 1968 and 2019. So in 2019, before the pandemic, a full-time minimum wage worker in the United States could actually not afford to rent an apartment, a two-bedroom apartment in any city in the United States. So I want to highlight the impact that women workers, and particularly workers of color, were facing prior to the pandemic. Nearly 70% of the lowest wage workers in the United States were women. Low wage workers were particularly likely to experience sexual harassment in the workplace and had a difficult time vindicating their rights, even under the laws that protect workers in the United States when they did not have a union. And as I'm sure you're aware, union density in the private sector in the United States is now below 7%. And so workers that don't have a union really have no way to protect themselves. So what happened in the pandemic? This very precarious situation of workers that was already precarious became much worse. The vulnerable workers were obviously needed to continue to go to work because of the nature of their work, and this was especially true for women of color. As I mentioned, we organize women and workers in the caregiving sectors, in home care and childcare and fast food. And these workers were deemed essential at the beginning of the pandemic, but they had to continue to go to work, to continue to make ends meet. And then they were also facing a caregiving crisis, oftentimes in their own homes, as schools closed, childcare centers closed, and other safety net systems that low-wage workers relied upon actually closed. And so this was just adding to the struggles that I already mentioned pre-pandemic. Caregivers, by definition, particularly for the elderly, had to continue to go to work, and they couldn't socially distance. They were themselves put at risk of falling ill from COVID-19. They had to leave the safety of their homes. They had to continue to ride public transportation to get to their workplaces, because they often faced no other option. And then fast food workers, a uniquely discriminated against population in the United States, often faced employers who shamelessly put profits over the workers' safety. Over the course of the pandemic, fast food workers have filed hundreds and hundreds of health and safety complaints related to COVID-19 safety issues throughout the United States. And I want to tell one particularly egregious story that you may have even heard of. A McDonald's franchise in Oakland, California became famous after the management literally provided the workers with doggy diapers and told them to put them over their faces to use as masks. This is, again, a largely non-union workforce in the United States. And so many of these workers feared speaking up. This example in Oakland is just an example, but it's something that we have heard about from workers throughout the country throughout the pandemic. And then I just want to say that in response to the pandemic, I know you've probably aware the United States did pass several major pieces of landmark legislation to address working conditions, but these relief efforts contain gaps, and these gaps often disproportionately left out women workers such as those in caregiving and fast food. For example, there was legislation that required employers to provide 2 weeks of paid sick leave for workers who contracted COVID. You think that this is paid sick leave is not available otherwise under federal law in the United States. But there were exclusions for certain corporations, such as those in the fast food industry, and therefore fast food workers, in addition to childcare and home care workers, were largely not covered by these standards that applied to other workplaces because they worked in people's homes. And so as a result, the workers who cared for and fed our communities throughout the pandemic were the most often denied sick leave, denied family leave, hazard pay, and the basic protections such as masks and gloves that they needed. And the exclusions from the laws that were passed to protect workers had a disproportionate effect on women and women of color who make up the majority in these industries. So what happened? As folks have already mentioned, workers in the United States are standing up and to demand that they be respected and protected and paid. Again, sort of basic demands that one would think would be obvious. But these simple requests to treat workers with respect and dignity and pay they deserve have really become a rallying cry among workers in the United States. The shift in understanding about what is essential work pushed our members of SEIU into the streets, even with the pandemic in full force. Workers began to strike. There's people have been calling this month Striketober in the United States because so many workers have gone on strike, whether it's to protest the lack of protective equipment or the lack of sick leave. And in addition, I want to note that workers have stepped out in solidarity with the Black Lives Matter movement and gone into the streets in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. My slides are somehow getting ahead of me, so I want to go back because I want to talk a little bit about some historic wins that we have achieved in the United States since the pandemic. The biggest of which is the historic unionization of childcare workers in California. 40,000 childcare providers, 96% of whom are women, formed a union during the pandemic. This is a really incredible feat, given that these childcare workers are family childcare workers, which means they provide childcare in their homes. And now these workers are using their voice to demand increased wages, but also increased investment into our caregiving system. Workers are also organizing, as I mentioned, through what we call the Care is Essential campaign. And this is a proposal for the federal government to fund home care, which we just heard about, and to invest hundreds of billions of dollars, not just to provide funding for people who receive the care, but to provide increased funding for the workers. So the Care is Essential plan focuses on the caregiver and on the care recipient. And then finally, the other campaign that I just wanted to note is that fast food workers in California, where we have a federal system, so are campaigning to pass a law called the Fast Recovery Act. And this legislation would allow fast food workers to create a fast food sector council that would bring together labor and government and business to set stronger wages and working conditions across this industry, and would make fast food corporations have liability for workplace violations at their franchisee stores. This is a long overdue need for fast food workers in this country, and we're hoping that California passes the Fast Recovery Act and then other states follow suit. Finally, I just want to note that as we build back better in the United States, we are also working to have an opportunity for all workers to have the ability to form a union. Unfortunately, the United States, our labor laws do not provide an opportunity for all workers to form a union, and SEIU, together with our other labor partners, are working for labor law reform in the United States that will prevent workers that have been deemed essential in the time of the pandemic.
Well, thank you so much, Nicole. Next, we have Nikki Hound. She is with the Trade Unions Congress and serves as their women's policy officer. So Nikki, if you could take it away, and thank you for joining us.
Great, thanks, Michael. So yeah, hi, I'm Nikki Hound. I'm the National Women's Officer for the TUC. So the TUC is the national centre representing trade unions across the UK. The trade union movement in the UK has over 6 million members, 57% of whom are women. So as everyone said, we all recognise that the pandemic has shone a light on the multiple structural inequalities that exist across our societies, and indeed it has exacerbated them. It's also reinforced what trade unions have known and campaigned on for decades, that many of our essential workers are underpaid, undervalued, overworked, and frankly taken for granted. And no surprise then that many of our essential workers are women who also have plenty of experience of being underpaid, undervalued, overworked, and taken for granted. TUC research during the pandemic estimated that nearly 10 million employees in the UK are key workers. So that's about 35% of employees. Around 54% are working in the private sector and around 46% in the public sector. Women are almost twice as likely to be working in key worker occupations than men, and Black and minority ethnic workers are also more likely to be key workers than white workers. Many of the largest key worker occupations have a large majority of female employees. Care workers, home carers, nurses, primary and nursery education professionals and teaching assistants and shop floor retail workers, for example, are some of the largest key worker occupations. In many of these occupations, over 80% of employees are women. Our research suggests that more than a third of key workers are paid below the real living wage of £10 per hour. There are differences between the public and private sector, with half of the private sector key workers being paid below £10 per hour compared to 22% of public sector key workers. Our analysis also shows that women are more likely to be underpaid once they are in key worker occupations. So 41% of female key workers are paid below the living wage in comparison to 32% of male key workers. We also know that insecure work and zero hours contracts are a problem for many key workers. For example, 1 in 4 workers in adult social care in the UK, which is one of the sectors hardest hit by the virus, are on 0 hours contracts. And we also know the use of 0 hours in sectors like retail and hospitality is increasing. Outsourcing in some public sector occupations also compound the issue of insecure work and low pay. Here in the UK, due to years of austerity and the public sector pay freeze, many essential workers in the public sector who may be perceived to be better paid and in more secure work are also actually struggling. For example, nurses' pay in real terms is down around £2,500 annually versus 2010 levels. Similarly, in maternity care, assistants and nursery nurses' pay is down around £2,000 in real terms versus a decade ago. Teachers' pay is around 8% lower now than it was in 2007 when you adjust for inflation. And we know going into this pandemic in the UK, wages had barely recovered to pre-2008 financial crisis levels. All of this means that our essential workers, many of whom are women, are struggling to make ends meet. Recent TUC research found that 1 in 5 key workers have had to cut back on spending since the pandemic began, with 1 in 9 saying that their levels of debt have increased. TUC research also found that 1 million children living in key worker households are living in poverty. These issues existed before the pandemic and they have worsened, but I now just want to turn to some of the specific impacts of the pandemic. So 1 in 5 key workers in the public sector are considering quitting or have already taken steps to change their careers. Low pay, excessive workloads, and not being valued during this pandemic are pushing key workers to the brink. And even before this pandemic, we already had 100,000 vacancies in health and social care alone. And research from the National Education Union published this year found that 1 in 3 teachers plan to quit due to unmanageable workloads and a lack of respect for the profession. The pandemic has increased the abuse and harassment that many frontline workers in public-facing roles have had to deal with. USDOR, which is the shop workers union, run an annual Freedom from Fear survey. The 2020 results show that 79% of shop workers said that the abuse they had faced had worsened in 2020 versus the previous year. 88% experienced verbal abuse, 60% were threatened by a customer, and nearly 1 in 10 were actually assaulted. The safety measures required due to the pandemic were cited as the most common trigger for the abuse. We know for women, and particularly mums, the combination of being on the front line and juggling their own caring responsibilities has left many feeling completely broken. A survey that we did in January 2021 of working mums, many of whom were key workers, found that 9 out of 10 had seen their mental health deteriorate because of the impact of trying to juggle work, care, and homeschooling during the pandemic. A survey that we did of working mums ahead of the summer holidays this year found that 60% of key workers did not have the childcare that they needed to be able to manage work and childcare over the summer holidays. Similarly, recent research from the TUC looking at working mums in general found that half of working mums who had made a flexible working request had had them fully or partially turned down by their employer. I now want to turn to long COVID, which is a health and economic crisis in the making. We did research earlier this year which revealed that 3 in 10 workers had been experiencing long COVID symptoms such as fatigue, brain fog, dizziness, migraines and aches for 12 months or more. 79% of respondents to our survey were key workers and 2/3 were women. And they were telling us that they are not being supported with their symptoms. Over half of respondents to our survey said that they had been discriminated against or disadvantaged at work. Workers told us that they were being met with suspicion by their employers, disbelief that their symptoms were as severe as they said, and that time off sick was triggering disciplinary and HR processes. 1 in 20 had been forced out of their jobs. Here in the UK, with cases on the rise and Plan B being discussed, and workers on the front line in education, care and health services already in the thick of another wave, and with essential workers in our supermarkets and supply chains also grappling with shortages as we head into the Christmas period, the pandemic and its disproportionate impact on women in general, and particularly our key workers, is far from over. So what are some of the policies that can help? Well, here in the UK, ending the public sector pay pause and ensuring that this week's comprehensive spending review reverses a decade of lost pay and fully restores the value of public sector workers' pay to 2010 levels would make a huge difference. New analysis from the TUC and Landman Economics shows that reversing public sector pay cuts would leave 4.3 million public sector workers better off, and restoring median pay by 3.2%, which is in line with CPI inflation, would boost the economy by £3.3 billion. We also want to see the national minimum wage raised to £10 per hour. This will benefit around 2 million key workers, many of whom are women working in the private sector. We want all public service workers to get a fair pay rise, and we want funding for the public sector so that all outsourced workers get a pay rise to at least the real living wage and pay parity with directly employed staff. Here in the UK, we have universal credit, which is our main welfare system. We want to see the cut to universal credit reversed. This cut disproportionately impacts women and women-led families. It is estimated that the removal of the £20 uplift will push around 500,000 people into poverty, including 200,000 children, and it will hit 2.3 million low-paid workers, many of whom are key workers. Families with children will be disproportionately impacted, particularly single-parent families. Around 59% of all single-parent families, overwhelmingly led by women, will experience their income falling by the equivalent of £1,000 per year because of the cut to universal credit or working tax credits. The basic rate of universal credit, anyway, is only worth about 1/6 of average pay. We think universal credit should be increased to £260 per week, which is 80% of the real living wage. And we also need to see the removal of things like the 2-child limit and the 5-week wait. We need to fund wraparound affordable childcare. This is essential for working families. A recent survey that we took part in with other partners found that 1/3 of respondents' monthly childcare costs were more than their rent or mortgage payments. We also want to see greater flexibility. Flexibility is a right from day one and advertised up front. Not all jobs can offer every form of flexibility, but all jobs can offer some form of flexibility, including in frontline occupations. We also have a not particularly good statutory sick pay system here in the UK. We want to see statutory sick pay increased to £330 a week, which is in line with the real living wage, and we want to see the lower earnings threshold removed. So under the lower earnings threshold, if you aren't aware of it, you have to earn a certain amount before you can qualify for statutory sick pay. 1 in 10 women do not earn enough to qualify for statutory sick pay. If the lower earnings limit was removed, 70% of the beneficiaries would be women. And then just regarding long COVID, we think that it should be recognised as a disability and an occupational health risk. If it was recognised as a disability, which it could be under the Equality Act in the UK, this would make it easier for people with long COVID to make reasonable adjustment requests of their employers, such as things like flexible working to allow them to manage their symptoms. But I'll leave it there, but I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Nikki. So we're going to start our Q&A session. So if you have a question for any of the panelists, there's a logo that says Q&A on, it should be on the bottom of your Zoom screen. So any audience members can submit a question during the Q&A session. But to start off, Nikki, going with you, you mentioned 0-hour contracts. Can you explain a little bit more about what those exactly are and the negative impacts they have for essential workers?
Yeah, sure. So 0 hours contracts are basically where someone is classed as an employee. So they are part on the payroll system, they're not self-employed or anything like that, but basically they have no contracted hours. So one week they could be working 40 hours a week or more, the next week they could be working 0. And you know, it's often cited for people who support 0 hours contracts that it's like a really great form of flexibility, but it's completely flexibility in one direction for the benefit of the employer and not the person who's working. And obviously what it means is that people cannot plan their finances. They don't know from one week to the next what they're going to be earning, and we often find that people who are on 0 hours contracts are often people who are struggling financially. You know, they often get into more debt because they're just having to sort of, you know, use credit cards and stuff to bridge that gap when they don't get the hours. And it also means that workers are sort of worried about using their voice and making demands because they know that they'll be penalised by their employer by having their hours removed if they do take any form of action. And we found in the UK over recent years and during the pandemic, so 0 hours contracts have been around for a while, but they have been steadily increasing year on year. And during the pandemic, the number of people on 0 hours contracts increased to over 1 million people for the first time. And again, when you look at who is on 0 hours contracts, it's majority women, it's often Black and minority ethnic workers, it's people working in the care sector, increasingly in retail and supply chain. So it makes work more precarious, and we can't see any reason for it. And I think in Ireland they've actually recently banned the use of them, so it is something that can be done, and it's something that we continue to push for.
And Nicole, can you explain what would be the comparable classification in the U.S., whether it's the gig economy or your contractors, and some of the issues with misclassification of essential workers and how that impacts them?
Yeah, as Nikki was talking, I was struck by the concept that the 0 hour contract was unusual and something to be eliminated, because in the United States, we struggle with a problem that even comes before. We, of course, in the non-union private sector, most workers are at will, which means they can be fired at any time for any reason, so long as it's not because of a protected classification such as race or gender. But because our workforce is at will, many workers in the United States work under the conditions that Nikki stated. In fact, fast food workers will often go to work, and then if there's a low demand in the store, they'll be sent home even after they've shown up on the job for a shift. And one of the things that we're trying to push in the states and at the federal level in the United States is a ban on employers' ability to call people off involuntarily after they've shown up at work, because of course the lack of the ability to plan that Nikki mentioned is not only the economic inability to plan how much money will be coming in from week to week, it's also a problem for caregivers themselves, because childcare, for example, care for elderly ones needs to be planned in advance. And so an individual worker who can't plan her hours, what hours she works, how many hours she works, it does have to plan for care for her loved ones while she is at work. The second thing I want to mention is about misclassification, and that is a huge problem in the United States, particularly in the gig classified as employees, being classified instead as independent contractors, and then not receiving any of the rights or benefits that employees are receive at the state and federal level. And so, in misclassification in all of the care workforces is a huge problem that faces low-wage workers in particular and workers in the gig economy, such as drivers for Uber and Lyft and other delivery workers. And of course, during the pandemic, I didn't address this, but delivery workers continue to work delivering food from restaurants, delivering food from grocery stores, and all of that within the gig economy. So workers who do not receive the benefits of workplace protections. In California, there was an effort to classify gig workers in these drive programs as employees rather than independent contractors. And the industry, Uber and Lyft, spent hundreds of millions of dollars to have a ballot initiative called Prop 22. Proposition 22 passed to overturn these protections of gig workers, and it was the most highly funded ballot initiative ever on the ballot in California, perhaps in the United States. Over $200 million going into the funding of this ballot initiative, which did pass, but was actually recently overturned in the courts as unconstitutional under the California Constitution. So for now, that issue is being litigated in the United States, but it is certainly the misclassification of workers, gig workers, low-wage workers, and women workers continues to be a problem and has only become more exacerbated in the pandemic.
Thank you, Nicole. So we have a couple of questions coming in from the audience. This question is from Kath Campbell. I think Nikki would be best positioned to answer this, but I think we can get into how this looks in other countries. Her question is the Scottish government has committed to introduce a system of wraparound school-aged childcare over the next parliament, free to those on the lowest income. What are the most important factors for key workers accessing this, in your opinion?
I think the key is that whoever is accessing it, it needs to be affordable. So it might be free for some people, but I think across the board, it does need to be affordable, because we see here in the UK, as I'm sure is, well, I know it's not the case in other countries where they do have great childcare, but I'm sure it's the case in the States as well, that the cost of childcare is absolutely astronomical. I mean, you are talking people paying, like, so we did a survey recently where people said that like they spent more on childcare than they did their monthly rent or mortgage payments. But I mean, when we did our summer holidays childcare survey recently and previous stuff we've done on this, like people are spending thousands of pounds a month on their childcare. Like for a lot of women, it's actually not financially worth them going to work in that sense, but they go because they want to and they want to progress and it's really important and they want to be in the labour market. But the cost of childcare is increasingly freezing parents and particularly women out of the labour market. So I think it has to be genuinely affordable. And I think as well for a lot of key workers, we also do need to think about what does a system look like that is genuinely wraparound, because actually a lot of essential workers aren't working 9 to 5 or even 7 to 4. They're working night shifts as well. And how do you support that and how do you manage that? And the other thing that I would say is that something that people who are key workers who are often forgotten are actually childcare workers and early years workers. And again, in the UK, as I'm sure is the case in many places, childcare workers are some of the lowest paid people in the economy. Like, so we've found that like there's a certain percentage who are paid like below the minimum wage, so they're not even getting minimum wage, which we know isn't enough to live off anyway. So I think there is also a thing about not only making it accessible and affordable to everybody, but also ensuring that childcare workers are paid the living wage as well, and that their skills and qualifications are recognised in a similar way that we do with teaching assistants and other early years professions.
Well, thank you,
yeah,
Nikki.
I just wanted to echo everything Nikki said about accessibility to childcare and affordability for childcare in the United States. It's a huge problem, and the caregiving economy is, as I mentioned, majority women in many states, majority women of color, and these are workers who are non-union and have very few rights under our state and federal laws. Oftentimes, they are themselves actually considered independent contractors when they are providing care, and so they're having to pay their own Social Security taxes, they're having to pay their own unemployment taxes, and receiving very small subsidies per child. And so the caregiving economy is a huge part of the workforce, and one that needs the protections of the law in order to, frankly, protect the women who are providing the care and the children who are receiving the care as well. And as you mentioned, women are consumers of childcare and providers of childcare, and so women are on both sides of the caregiving equation.
Thank you, Nicole. So our next question is for Michael. Michael, can you talk about some of the reforms that are needed in Austria for the live-in care model? And have you seen any examples in Austria or elsewhere of live-in care workers organizing to improve their situation?
Thanks for the question. We have a public discussion in Austria, because I didn't say during my presentation, but in Austria, living care workers are actually self-employed, though self-employment means a little bit different in Austria because they're part of the regular social insurance system. So even self-employed care workers pay into health insurance, into pension, the pension fund. So this is part of their job, but part of also being self-employed in Austria. However, we have this discussion if this is actually self-employed, because this is not, you are in a household and you actually do everything that you're asked to. Like if it's the family who tells you what to do, or it's an agency that brings you into the household, but you're not free to do whatever however you want to perform your job. You're actually told when to do certain things. So when we looked at agencies, I used to work as a care worker before I went into academia. And in nursing homes, we had like the documentation, like what we documented by hand, what we did with our patients is similar to a lot of agencies, what they ask the care workers to do. So they actually give them things to do in a certain way that the agency wants. And we actually have an upcoming court case to determine if living care work can actually be performed as a self-employee. If we look at other countries, we can also see that organizing does help improve the working conditions, especially in Switzerland. In Switzerland, living care workers are employees either of agencies or the households directly. So they can unionize because they are employees, unlike some self-employees in Austria. So unions can help them organize. And in Switzerland, we actually have 2 unions that have worked considerably with living care workers. And they went to the courts repeatedly, not a lot, but like on certain important issues. And we've seen that over the time, agencies and households got like more careful when it comes to the contracts, not only what they actually write into contracts, but also how to literally, they ask their employees to perform their contracts. So you can see changes in a positive way. And we also have in Germany, it's still ongoing, but there is also a court case coming up about living care, and that standby time is working time under EU law. Michael, you're muted.
So we have another question from the audience. Nicole, if you want to start off with this one, Bonnie Chun asks, what can employers do to support women who have had to juggle full-time childcare and full-time work? mentioning the COVID pandemic has meant women are either having to do both or face burnout or mental health problems or lose their jobs for putting their families first and then have to deal with the financial implications of that. So, can you get into some of the policy reforms that have been going on in the U.S. discussions wise, and what you see as some of the solutions for that?
So unfortunately, with the lack of action at the federal level to protect workers in the United States, oftentimes policies do fall to the individual employers. So for example, healthcare is oftentimes provided by employers, and the level of healthcare varies employer to employer, as do policies around care leave for caregiving and support for caregiving. And so individual corporations, for example, in the United States, in response to the Fight for 15, to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, individual corporations have taken a decision to raise their internal minimum wage to 15. The problem with the employer as the solution is, of course, that the burden disproportionately of the cost of these programs, whether it's childcare, paid leave, healthcare, or an increased wage, is that then the burden falls disproportionately on high road employers that choose to make these changes. And we support certainly employers making these kinds of policy changes, and oftentimes they are leading the way for the rest of their industry or for the rest of the economy in doing so. But the change really has to come from a government level. It can't be left to individual employers. It has to be a policy. And we believe there needs to be a national policy on paid family leave, on paid subsidies for childcare for low-wage workers, and of course, increasing health and safety standards and increasing the federal minimum wage. Without these protections, workers will be left to and vulnerable to the vagaries of their individual employer. And as I mentioned at the beginning, in particular for low-wage workers, it's very difficult to vindicate their rights under the laws that do exist, because in a non-union setting, which is the vast majority of the workforces in our country, in order to vindicate their individual rights, workers have to generally retain a private attorney. And for low-wage workers, there are barriers to doing so because the recoveries under the law are so low. And so the change needs to be systemic change. It can't be an individual employer change, and employers can themselves push for these changes and join the effort to lobby lawmakers to have these changes go into effect. And I do believe that the high road employers that care about their workers being able to balance and survive the pandemic can make a difference using their political power and have a seat at the table on a political level as well.
Oh, thank you so much, Nicole. I'm not sure how much time we have left, but I wanted to give a couple of minutes in case anyone has any closing statements or anything they want our audience to know about what essential workers have gone through during the pandemic, or anything the public should be aware of, or how the public can help improve their working conditions, and what a person watching this can do to take action or get involved to help organizing or improve these conditions.
I don't mind going first. So first of all, if you are watching, join a union. That collective, you would expect me to say that, but that collective voice, I think, does really make a difference, and it does, it really does enhance everyone's power when people come together collectively with a joint aim. So I would recommend that. I think in terms of here in the UK, we are having better discourse maybe on public sector pay and stuff, and we have the spending review this week. We do expect the Chancellor to announce some things. I don't think it will be enough. So I think what we need is for people to be looking at their opportunities to lobby, whether that's their local MP or, through those avenues, to sort of really get the government to recognise the scale of the challenge. Like, we are talking about existing inequalities and then the pandemic on top of it. Like, tinkering around the edges is not going to be the thing that is the way to respond to the pandemic or climate change or the persistent structural inequalities faced by women in other communities. So I would just say, get vocal and look for the ways that you can influence. And then, in your workplace as well, find out what's going on. And just, I think, lending that, if you're not an essential worker yourself, lending that support to essential workers, I think is really important, especially because I think going into Christmas, I think they're going to have a really difficult time, to be honest. So I think that it's really important that we show that when we're accessing essential services ourselves, that we've got their backs.
Thank you, Nikki. Michael, if you want to go next.
I think we should just try to get back to where we were at the beginning of the pandemic, when we showed a lot of support for care workers and their causes, or critical workers in general. Like, at the beginning, I don't mean the clapping, like that was just symbolic most of the time, but the support behind the clapping, that the appreciation for critical workers. I think if we go back to that mindset, we can help critical workers when they, for example, go on strike, and not like why are they going on strike or something like that. But just to think back to the time where we had to support them because they were the only people, or most of the people, going out. So we put a lot of money into, at least in my understanding, into an economy during the pandemic to save our economies. So if we put a little bit of the money towards the workers, the critical workers, to help them have better jobs, that would also be something that, if we support it as a society, or as many people as possible, then I think that would be a big help. Because there are strikes. I didn't mention it because it's also in early childcare, but in Austria we do have those strikes currently going on. So if you have the opportunity to support those strikes or to support other efforts, I think that's a really big step up.
Thank you, Michael. And Nicole with the SEIU.
I put an opportunity to help care workers in the chat. careisessential.org is our organization that we have joined together with people with disabilities, the elderly, and care workers, for calling for the federal government to put in a game-changing investment into home care. And it would make it easier for seniors and people with disabilities to get the care they need, but also will create good union jobs for caregivers, which is the fastest growing job in the United States. And so that's an opportunity for you to get involved at careisessential.org and to support caregivers in the care economy.
All right. Well, thank you, Nicole. In the chat, each one of our panelists included some links to research, that they've been involved in, or other organizations have conducted. If you're interested in learning more about some of the work they've been doing, Nicole, Nikki, and Michael, thank you for joining us. I'm gonna pass off to Rose if she has any closing statements before we go. I know there will be a link video of recorded video of this panel in case anyone wants to go back. And our social medias have been linked if you have any extra questions. I know I'm available. For any research questions, if anyone out there has any interest in learning more or needs to find any specific data in the US. So thank you again for putting this together, and it was a pleasure meeting all of you.
Yeah, I'll just echo that. It's been a great hour. I've learned a lot, and thanks to everyone who attended, and thank you so much to all of our speakers for joining as well. And take care and have a great day. Bye.